Agents of fear. Bioweapons are banned and outlawed by international treaty. Yet for decades they've been a military and terrorist threat. Rogue nations around the world have been developing their military biological capability. Extremist terror groups have been caught experimenting with germs. But in the wake of September the 11th, the threat of a major biological terrorist attack became real and immediate. Just over a week later, that threat was executed with the delivery of anthrax through the US postal system. Bioterrorism had arrived. But how serious is the threat of bioweapons? How can we defend against it? And how could we deal with the outcome if the worst were to happen? Invisible, silent, deadly. Biological weapons operate by stealth, killing their victims without warning. No bomb, no explosion. The principle is simple. Take a bacteria or virus and use it to infect the enemy. Any disease from flu to Ebola, measles to salmonella could in theory be used. The more dangerous the disease, the more deadly the weapon.
Biological warfare agents are strategic in nature. They will kill or incapacitate anywhere from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, depending on their employment. You can't see them, you can't feel them, you can't touch them. There's terror associated also with just the threat of use of biological warfare agents.
But biological weapons are not new or necessarily sophisticated. The idea of using deadly viruses or bacteria to attack the enemy has been with us for centuries. In the Middle Ages, the bodies of plague victims were catapulted into besieged cities to infect the people inside.
Of the two sorts of weapon, there is a non-contagious and there is a contagious. The difference really is down to whether a person who's been infected with the organism can transmit it to somebody else.
Highly contagious and highly lethal, plague is still considered a good germ weapon today. Its effects on the body can kill within 48 hours. Another contagious killer, smallpox, is perhaps the most feared bioweapon of all. One of the most lethal diseases in history. Up to 50% of its victims die.
With smallpox, you can be within 6 feet of a group of people and you can infect all of them. So it's highly infective, and that's through your breath. So the organisms are being transmitted out of your breath to other people who then breathe them in.
With an infectious weapon like smallpox, the number of casualties is in theory almost limitless. Medical reports estimate an outbreak in the US could kill up to 1 million people in 3 months. Until recent events, this was not an option thought likely or even possible.
This is a new kind of terrorism, and we've seen this obviously with the events of September the 11th. These people are anxious, their aim is to kill Americans, it seems. Therefore, it probably makes it more likely that they could consider using an infectious weapon rather than a weapon like anthrax, which isn't infectious.
But they'd be taking a big risk. Infectious germs are impossible to control. Spreading globally, they could eventually spread back to the terrorists themselves and their own people. For this reason, non-infectious diseases that can be targeted more precisely are more typically seen as ideal bioweapons, like botulinum. This most poisonous of toxins causes paralysis, respiratory failure, and frequently death. And then there's anthrax.
It's a naturally occurring disease which is an endemic in large parts of the world. It's a disease that affects people that deal with hides and skins and tanners and sheep shearers and people like that. But it's not easily ingested into the lung, and there are very, very few cases of pulmonary anthrax death. What's different about anthrax as a bioweapon is that it's been machined in a way which makes it go down into the lungs and create the disease inside the lungs, which is almost invariably fatal.
There are many fatal diseases, but anthrax is special as a bioweapon because the germs do not die easily. Most bacteria and viruses die in strong sunlight or cold temperatures and become ineffective within hours of being dispersed into the air. Anthrax is the exception. Its spores are remarkably tough. It's possible to make strands that can survive for up to 40 years. As a result, the release of the large quantity can contaminate a location for a generation.
You only have to look at the degree of horror and panic that it's causing amongst the population to see that even threatening a bioweapon can have its use to a terrorist. The whole population becomes extremely uneasy, and they don't know where things are going to pop up next.
Good morning. Here's the news. Civil Defense Headquarters announced today that the sharp increase in the number of cases of illness during the last few days have led authorities to suspect that a biological warfare attack may have taken place.
50 years ago, in the early years of the Cold War, fear of biological warfare led the US government to make public information films about the potential threat from bioweapons. But it wasn't until the mid-90s, just 6 years before the events of September the 11th, that there was the first hard evidence that terrorists were planning to use bioweapons. March 20th, 1995, Tokyo. 5,000 people are injured, 12 killed, after breathing in a toxin seeping from food packages planted on a subway by a Japanese religious cult, the Aum Shinrikyo. This attack was chemical, but the group had invested substantial resources into developing bioweapons. Even traveling to Zaire during an outbreak of Ebola fever to collect germs. If weaponized, this virus would be devastating. It has no cure. 90% of victims in Africa hemorrhage to death. The cult attempted to use botulinum and anthrax on more than 8 occasions. None of the attacks resulted in deaths, but the potential was there, a potential that has now been executed by others in the US.
It's absolutely clear that the latent capacity to produce and use biological weapons is increasing. It's also evident that terrorist groups are becoming more inclined to commit indiscriminate acts of mass violence than they have in the past.
In a new age of bioterrorism, the major cities of the West are particularly under threat. But how easy is it for a terrorist to go about making a bioweapon? Although the idea of using deadly germs as weapons has been around for centuries, turning them into usable weapons is not easy. And for terrorists operating in secret, it's more difficult still. The terrorist faces 2 central questions: how to obtain the right germs, and how then to deliver them to the target population.
Yes, I'd like to place an order here to 0068-562. That'll be Yersinia pestis, Bombay strain.
There are 470 germ banks across 60 countries. Access is restricted, but a former member of a white supremacist group, Larry Harris, showed how easily an extremist could obtain deadly germs. Posing as a medical researcher, he contacted a lab.
I ordered 3 vials of bubonic plague. And basically, get a catalog off the shelf, reach through, call them up, give them a charge card number, and they send it to me. Plain and simple. Yes, that is Yersinia pestis. That is correct. As far as a person getting into the biological business, you need nothing more than a very small laboratory. If you look at the size of this room, it's probably 10 by 12. And I have everything here necessary. I could easily work with plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, brucellosis, tularemia. It's very easy to obtain.
Harris's only mistake was to pursue one of his orders too eagerly. The police were called in by the supplier of microorganisms, the American Type and Culture Collection. In the United States, it's not illegal to possess lethal bacteria, so all Harris could be convicted of was mail fraud. During the trial, he claimed he was making vaccines to protect himself and his family. For civilians, though, making germ weapons is not as simple as Harris makes out. Growing the bugs and keeping them alive might be easy, but they then need to be delivered into the bloodstream of the enemy. To do this, they must be the right size particle to stay in the air, and after being inhaled, to get through the mucous membranes in human lungs.
The first stage is relatively straightforward. Any microbiologist with a little bit of access to non-specialized equipment can manufacture biological warfare agents at home or in a very rudimentary laboratory. But that's not the end of the story. You need to get it into a form whereby it can get inside the lungs, it can be inhaled, and it can then cause the damage, and that's the tricky part.
Tricky, maybe. But that's what the terrorists who sent the anthrax letters in the United States succeeded in doing. Some of the envelopes contained weapons-grade anthrax, milled to the precise size to be inhaled and lodge in the lungs, 1 to 5 microns, small enough to be breathed in and big enough not to be breathed out. It had also been chemically treated to help suspend it in the air. Those who died are likely to have breathed in the deadly spores, possibly by sniffing the powder out of curiosity. Other victims contracted the less malevolent skin form of anthrax. Fatal in less than 20% of cases, it's usually controlled and treated with antibiotics. Obtaining the germs is for the terrorist only the first stage in preparing a usable weapon. Underground extremist groups have made videos supposedly showing how bioweapons can be made given the initial ingredients.
First, I'm going to put on a glove because any of this moisture that gets on your hands, that is extremely poisonous. So we don't want to get that on the hands, at least not on your hands.
The video makes out that elementary protection will be sufficient to avoid contamination.
Now you need the face mask on at this point because you don't want to snuff up any of the powder up your nose, because that would be really bad after a while. Now you really have some lethal stuff here.
In military research institutes, technicians operate with rather more sophisticated equipment.
It's clear any terrorist that considers producing or using a biological weapon is going to put themselves at some considerable personal risk. And we believe that weighs fairly heavily in their calculations. These are very dangerous organisms.
The terrorists behind the anthrax attacks will need to have taken great care in handling their high-grade anthrax germs. Like motes of dust, anthrax spores hang suspended in the air, so the terrorists would need to seal up doors and windows to stop a draft spreading the germs. Even so, spores would remain on any surfaces in the room, including on their own protective clothing.
They could have taken simple precautions like wearing a respirator and some kind of protective clothing which could then be burnt or made or buried afterwards.
The germs themselves would of course be kept in a sealed container. But as soon as it was opened, the invisible spores would begin to disperse into the air. Even if great care was taken transferring the anthrax powder, all surfaces in the room would become infected and would remain so unless treated for many years. Licking the envelope would not be advisable. As far as possible, the external surfaces of the envelope would be cleaned of spores. For spores left on the envelope can be transferred to everything it comes into contact with. Even posting the envelope is not as straightforward as it seems.
In order to carry the anthrax around, the envelopes would have to be in some kind of sealed container, because an envelope itself isn't obviously airtight, and it'll act like a bellows as it's handled, and the dust will go in and out.
Walking to the mailbox in a gas mask would hardly be a credible strategy for a terrorist. So there would be a risk as the envelopes were posted. Despite its simplicity, sending anthrax through the post has turned out to be a means of delivery that creates widespread disruption, concern, and fear. The impact of bioweapons depends on more than the choice of germ. The means of delivery is equally and perhaps even more critical. Finding the most effective way to deliver the germs has perplexed military scientists ever since germ warfare research began. Back in the days following World War II, when the British and the Americans ran biological warfare programs, they invested considerable resources trying to solve the problems of delivery. And in the spirit of good old-fashioned espionage, FBI men carried out covert operations at train stations and terminals, dispersing clouds of bacteria to see how far the germs would travel. Using harmless strains, they pretended they were deadly plague or anthrax. They set up detection centers around the city to pick up the presence of the bacteria in the air, to gauge how many people would be affected, depending on what delivery system was used.
There were many trials carried out in both the UK and the United States, and a certain amount of cooperation on seeing the effects of biological agents delivered by a number of different means, be it unorthodox means, sabotage type means, from unconventional, maybe an aerosol generator in the back of a truck or on a boat offshore.
While the FBI worked undercover, the British were trying to find the most effective way to use germs in a military situation. On an island off the coast of Scotland, they used sheep to test the effectiveness of various means of delivery. They developed bombs and spray delivery systems which could disperse it in the air. The experiments showed that enough of the bugs could survive in the outside air or after a bomb explosion to cause many casualties. Some 50 years later, the island of Grignard remains too dangerous for human habitation. But there was a fundamental problem. You couldn't control who would be infected. One change in the wind direction could mean your own troops were killed by mistake, or that a civilian population living nearby was wiped out, leaving enemy troops unscathed.
Well, the key reason that the United States and Great Britain gave up their biological warfare capabilities is that they didn't think they were very useful. The military commanders didn't really see a contingency in which they'd ever want to use these things. They were hard to predict, hard to control. The adversary could retaliate with nuclear weapons.
But for the terrorist, the problems of delivery are very different. Less precision is required, but the system must allow the terrorist to deliver the weapons secretly and provide safety for the terrorists themselves. Infecting the water supplies is a possibility, but most bioweapon germs are killed by water, and in any case large quantities would be required. More potent and more deadly is airborne delivery. so that as with everyday diseases, people are infected just by breathing in.
For the terrorist, it doesn't have to be terribly sophisticated. As long as you can create somewhere in the area of the spray particles that are of the right size to get into your lungs amongst the range of sizes of particles, then you're obviously beginning to succeed. And most common spraying equipment could probably be used for that.
With the right germ and the appropriate conditions, many people, perhaps thousands, could be infected in a single night. Location is important. The terrorist would need to release the germ from a place where it could drift into a significant number of people. Enclosed spaces such as a subway or a major office building are one possibility. The release of the weapon would need to take place in seclusion, so the terrorist could change into protective clothing and operate the spray undisturbed. It would also need to take place at a site that could not afterwards be identified and linked to the terrorist. Crop dusters are theoretically possible, but for the germs to reach the public, the plane would need to fly very low, hardly inconspicuous or practical in cities. From the top of a high building is a more likely option. You'd have to make sure the wind was blowing in the right direction, as the germs might be carried upwards and away from the people below. The terrorist might generate a more lethal result simply using a spray from the window of a car. A major bioattack would require much larger quantities than can be delivered with a hand sprayer, which in turn raises the likelihood of being discovered. Nevertheless, it is estimated that 100 kilograms of anthrax delivered over Washington, D.C. could in theory result in more than 130,000 deaths. There can be no doubt that the threat of a serious biological attack is upon us. But where did the storm clouds gather? And why now? During the Cold War, the military in the US and Britain had failed to develop delivery systems. Possibly as a result, in 1972 an international treaty was signed with the Soviets agreeing to ban further research and destroy stockpiles of deadly agents. The biological threat appeared to be over. But biowarfare went underground. Some nations continued researching and experimenting with bioweapons, so that today some 15 countries have suspected biowarfare programs, including Syria, North Korea, Libya, and China, along with Iran and Iraq.
There's been a proliferation of technology, and that concerns us the most, in that the knowledge about how to deliver the agents, which is the most critical part, may now be available to adversaries of the United States.
One of these adversaries is Iraq, a regime that has not flinched from using chemical weapons on Kurdish villages, and a country which has for more than a decade been developing and stockpiling biological agents. We now know that just before the 1990 Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's scientists worked on several delivery systems. They simulated biological attacks using a crop dusting plane and tried to develop a remote-controlled MiG fighter capable of dropping biological agents. Anthrax was also loaded onto missiles and at least 200 aerial anthrax bombs manufactured. The missiles were intended to detonate on impact, scattering the deadly spores into the air. The threat of the use of these weapons was apparent throughout the Gulf War.
If Saddam had fired one of his anthrax-equipped Scud missiles, we really don't know what the effects would be. What we do know is that's not a terribly sophisticated design, and it's certainly not something that the U.S. military would regard as an efficient delivery system. But even if it didn't kill very many people, which is a possibility, the political effect that it would have had on the target area and the panic it would have caused in the population, I think, would have been very significant indeed.
When the war with Iraq was over, a UN inspections team, UNSCOM, entered the country to find out just what their germ weapon program consisted of.
You take your hand off my inspector now. I have instruction from my boss.
The Iraqis denied possessing biological weapons, let alone the means to manufacture them.
I don't touch him. You're touching me. If you touch me once more, I just talked to me.
They wouldn't admit to a program, and they even showed a group of journalists around their main production plant in early 1995, where they were saying, here is a single-cell protein plant, that's something which produces an additive for animal foods to improve its qualities, and also this is a biopesticide plant. And a key person in the program was showing these journalists around, saying these are perfectly innocent places.
Just 4 months later, after an Iraqi defector confirmed the UN's suspicions, Iraq was forced to admit that these supposed pesticide plants were in fact producing anthrax and other germ agents. The UN destroyed the factories it found, but when in 1998 Iraq blocked further inspections, Britain and America launched airstrikes against suspected weapon sites. Their aim was to destroy Iraq's biological capability once and for all. But bombs can only destroy known targets.
It's almost certain, I think, that Saddam Hussein's program will have continued after the departure of UNSCOM from Iraq and may well have gone underground, beyond the eyes of surveying satellites.
It is thought that Iraq still has stockpiles of botulinum, camelpox and anthrax. It's even rumoured they might have got their hands on smallpox. For it now appears that Iraq's bioweapon program may have been able to plunder the expertise of the most advanced biological program in the world, that of the former Soviet Union. Russian failure to fully back the UN's actions has fueled these suspicions.
There was a great reticence by Russia to involve itself too much in UNSCOM, and one of the signals there is possibly that it could have fingerprinted the bioweapon technology that exists in Iraq back to what is now Russia.
Prior to the signing of the 1972 treaty, the former Soviet Union is thought to have had the most advanced biological weapons in the world, with the most expert scientists. A cheap alternative option to the nuclear arms race, it was identified by the Russians as an area in which their scientific expertise could give them the upper hand. It was an advantage they were not prepared to abandon. Despite signing the treaty in 1972, suspicion grew that the Russians had not really given up their program. Then, in 1992, Dr. Ken Alibek, a key Russian scientist, defected. Western governments discovered the truth. In the 20 years since the signing of the treaty banning biological research, Russia had secretly developed new biological agents and built up a huge germ warfare arsenal.
Any possible agent, biological agent, that could be valuable for testing and applying in future biological weapons would be tested, would be developed, and would be turned into weapons.
Alibek worked at the Stepnogorsk plant in the desolate region of Kazakhstan. We now know that at this and other sites the Russians worked on all aspects of biological weapons. They made organisms that survived better and dispersed more effectively. And it is thought that they perfected ways of delivering the agents at long range, for example, loading them onto missiles.
So the Russians were working away on all this and had a range of agents that could be put in mainly missiles. They saw it as a strategic weapon. if you look at the time when they accelerated their development, they really pushed in, and I think that the scale of their program, I think they had 25,000 scientists working on it at some stage, and millions of dollars of worth of money being poured into it. And this was in the early 80s, at the time of the Star Wars. And it's clear from evidence that we now know that this was a technology where they thought, we have the edge, we must develop this, this will be a big surprise. Of course, they were absolutely right.
But this edge had an impact they were unlikely to predict. For the Russian program created an army of scientists with unique knowledge of biological weapon technology. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, most of the program has been dismantled, leaving the scientists without jobs.
My colleagues, a lot of them now are unemployed, and they've got nothing in many cases just to feed their families, their children. Some of them sell flowers in streets, very good, perfect scientists. Many of them are very angry now because of the situation in Russia. Now, if, for example, they received a proposal to do something for Iraq, for Iran, I cannot exclude they would do this.
They may well have taken their expertise and possibly their equipment and their knowledge into places like Iraq or possibly North Korea. So it's quite possible, I think, that Iraq had a lot of help in her bio program and may still have help as well.
It is the recent and secret history of biological weapon research that makes the current threat of bioterrorism so serious. The Russian bioweapon program developed new germs and new means of delivery. This knowledge is now almost certainly passed to other nations, and these nations, including Iraq, may either be involved in instigating terrorism directly or indirectly funding terrorists. So what can be done? How can nations defend themselves, faced with a threat of a major bioweapon attack? On the military front, US and Western forces have been in a race to develop defenses to the new bioweapon threat. During the 1990s, destroyers like the SS Mitcher were equipped with bioweapon defenses.
Mister, this is the officer deck. We have a cloud 1,500 yards off the port bow, set mop level 4.
The ship can be sealed and cleaned if under biological or chemical attack. But such defenses are useless unless those commanding the ship have advanced knowledge that they're under attack. And airborne germs are an enemy you can't see and you can't hear. The same problem applies to troops on the battlefield. Attempts have been made by the Army to develop a detection system to pick up and identify a biological attack.
Outside temperature is 73.1 degrees. Wind direction is at 70 degrees. Liquid samplers
BIDS, the Biological Integrated Detection System, is a mobile laboratory. It's set up behind front lines where it can check continuously to see if there's anything suspicious in the atmosphere. Closely guarded and hidden by camouflage, BIDS is capable of identifying many germ agents. But currently, it takes an average of 30 minutes to do so. A long wait, during which troops are left dangerously vulnerable.
One of the things I worry about is that we have units exposed, and that commander has to wait for that agent identification. Meanwhile, does he have to worry about setting up decontamination? There are all kinds of issues there, and all the time, while he's trying to make those decisions, that unit maybe can't do its combat mission. And our adversaries on a battlefield are going to take advantage of that.
BIDS may be a step towards defense from bioweapon attack, but it can't stop troops being exposed. Early warning is needed, technology that may also be useful in the protection of cities.
For the United States Army, the long-range biological standoff detection system is extremely critical to us because it gives us the capability to look out at long distances and to identify that a man-made cloud is present.
The long-range system, called LiDAR, can rapidly detect unusual clouds, but it can't tell what a cloud is made of. It could be anthrax, but it could also be pollen or some other organic material.
Backside, medevac 22, over. Roger, backside, medevac 22, Charlie 130, inbound, your location.
So currently, these new systems don't provide guaranteed warning of an attack. In a war situation, significant casualties would still be likely, and medical teams would face a challenge to isolate diseased and perhaps contagious soldiers. If there were many thousands, it would be difficult, if not impossible.
Vitals are normal. Could you check the air saturation, please? 97. Thank you.
Defense against bioweapons on the battlefield is difficult, but defense against a terrorist attack on cities is more difficult still. In the wake of the anthrax envelope attacks in the US, the question facing governments is how to improve current defenses. What can be done to prepare for the worst?
Go ahead, Bob. Well, we're saying that more and more people are going down. You received a report from the field, a radio transmission.
That chair over there, and let's get him out of here.
The US already has a training program in place. The Tokyo subway attacks had alerted them to the dangers and possible consequences of a terrorist biological attack. A limited civil defense program involving emergency services in trials was instigated.
We have a secondary device. We want to address Larry, Tommy, and Stevie, all right? Larry's going up on the primary device.
They were aware that the threat existed, but the leap of faith to fund programs, either to provide therapy or prevention, if you like, to the wider population and to beef up the response organisations hadn't got into place. And in all Western nations now, all potential target nations, programs for civil defence and for immunisation are now being resurrected and being funded.
The US has now been running the Domestic Preparedness Program for several years, a series of training exercises coordinated by the US Army for police, fire and ambulance services, showing them how to reduce panic and how to protect themselves from contaminated casualties. Army commanders in charge of the program hope it will prepare emergency services for a large-scale attack.
Being aware is a primary piece of being ready. And if we can make the cities aware and those critical first responders aware, we can make a bad situation not as bad.
Another part of being ready is ensuring hospitals have the resources and expertise to cope with a killer epidemic. After the anthrax attacks, the American Surgeon General called for an extra $1.5 billion to get the medical systems in place. Elsewhere, other governments are also acting. But the task is substantial. In a confidential document, the British government warned doctors and the emergency services that in the event of a biological attack, they should be prepared for the largest number of civilian casualties ever seen in the UK. Currently, hospitals, surgeries and mortuaries, they said, would be unable to cope. Moreover, the problems of containing the disease and the consequences for social order are great if the attack involved a contagious agent like smallpox or plague.
The effects are extremely widespread, and the only way you can control that is very, very tight control on movements of population. Now that's unpopular, obviously. If you can imagine a person that's been infected in their office at work and they're told not to move or to have contact with anybody else, I think they'd be extremely panicky, and the whole process of sane discussion really would begin to break down.
So in the event of an attack, is there anything the public can do in high-risk countries and cities to protect themselves? In the weeks following September the 11th, sales of gas masks and protective clothing in the US and the UK reached record numbers.
We've had a huge increase in inquiries for gas masks and any related accessories. People have been calling in a complete panic, who are literally scared for their lives, coming in, we want a gas mask, we don't care how much it costs, we don't care where it came from, just make sure we want gas masks for us, for our kids, for our parents. We're very worried about this. And any other clothing you have which will protect us in case this was to happen, we'll pay you for. Regardless of what it costs, we need it now.
In gas masks, the filters act as barriers to microscopic particles such as spores. They might offer some protection, but there are fundamental drawbacks.
You would have to be togged up before the event. And the point about bioweapons is the fact that they don't have a natural trigger. You don't know when the event has started, if you like. It's only when people are falling ill. So you may have your respirator with you, and it may offer you, A, very little protection, possibly, and secondly, you would need to be wearing it before the event, not after. So in a sense, it's probably not a very wise investment.
So what else can be done? Some of the germs, like anthrax, can be treated with antibiotics, if spotted in time, and if there are enough antibiotics to go round. Hardly surprising, therefore, that the Canadian government tried to acquire non-patented forms of the antibiotic to ensure enough supply. A more effective solution is vaccination. We don't have vaccines against plague and botulism, but they do exist for anthrax and smallpox. Currently, stockpiles are low. When smallpox was officially eradicated in 1980, production of the vaccine was almost stopped. The US currently has 15 million doses. Following the attack, the government put in an order for a further 300 million. So, threatened nations can protect themselves by training and preparing emergency services, by increasing surveillance. Supplies of antibiotics and vaccines can be made available, and plans for containment and rapid response put in place. Even so, a major bio-attack would still stretch the most sophisticated set of defenses. It would be a mistake to underestimate the present bioweapon threat. But technological developments are making the future look even more dangerous. Through genetic engineering, there's now the potential to create new and unknown diseases, and the potential to solve the problem of delivery once and for all with weapons that can be precisely targeted against specific people. At the US Army's Biological Research Center, scientists work to develop vaccines to protect against bioweapons. Until now, the range of diseases they were fighting against has been limited. But the new technology of genetic engineering has radically changed the situation.
When you look at current biological weapons, they have many shortcomings. They may be difficult to absorb. They may only survive in perfect weather conditions. They may, for example, be destroyed by cold or dryness in the atmosphere. So genetic engineering can be used to make that biological agent, that virus or that bacteria, more resistant, more likely to infect people.
Genetic engineering can improve existing agents, but it can also create completely new diseases. Inside a virus or bacteria, the DNA sequences determine how it behaves. It's now possible to introduce new genes into the DNA and change the nature of the organism. By mixing and matching the genes, a whole range of designer diseases could be invented. The breakthroughs in genetic techniques in the last 20 years have opened the door to a new era of germ weapons.
The revolution in the biosciences that we've seen since the 70s is every bit as profound as the nuclear revolution of 70 years ago, and could have quite devastating impacts on the future biowarfare and bioterrorism threat.
The greatest concern about the spread of Russian secrets is the claim that they invented a new generation of untreatable diseases. Genetically altered bugs which can overcome immunity through vaccination or resist treatment with antibiotics.
What is amazing is that genetically altered antibiotic-resistant plague was developed. Genetically altered antibiotic-resistant anthrax was developed. Genetically altered drug-resistant glanders was developed. Genetically altered immune-overcoming anthrax was developed. Of course, very difficult to say whether or not this strain would overcome vaccination caused by American or British vaccines, but Russians tested this agent using Russian vaccine, so-called STI-1 vaccine, and they were able to show that the normal genetically altered strain very easily overcomes vaccination immunity. This is a real situation.
Designer bugs are concerning, but they still face the problem of delivery. They could infect the wrong people. But genetic engineering hasn't stopped there. According to the British Medical Association, it may soon be possible to target germs so that they attack only certain people, people with a particular gene or set of genes, while leaving everyone else unharmed.
One hears talk about the development of a kind of ethnic weapon, a weapon that can be targeted to be effective against a particular racial group or group of people. For example, there had been certain developments in South Africa under the old apartheid regime where they were thinking along these lines of targeting, obviously a particular ethnic group.
In the mid-80s, the South African government sought out an ethnically targeted weapon. Testimony given to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigating the crimes of apartheid revealed the extent of these plans.
And this document contained a proposition from someone in Europe. And this guy says he's got a product, a bacteria, which has got the possibility of only affecting, making sick and killing pigmented people. And it was decided that it would be good if the government had this weapon.
At the time, the technology sought by the regime wasn't available. But developments in our understanding of DNA and the human genome have made it easier to identify the genetic differences between different peoples and race, and have made ethnically targeted weapons a possibility.
If you add together a number of different markers for different populations, you can start to become relatively specific. So, for example, the way in which we handle milk lactose is different between the Asian and European populations. If you then add in blood groups, ABO blood groups, very different distributions. If you also add in height, skin colour, and so on, you start to be able to become specific to your target population.
Once genetic markers have been identified, a virus could, in theory, look for them on entering the body. It would scan the DNA of cells, looking for the markers. If it finds them, it inserts itself into the host DNA and starts the process of infection. Successful genetic targeting is one of the golden prizes of medicine today. Millions of dollars are being invested in it in the hope of finding an answer to some of our biggest killer diseases. But there could well be a cost.
The technology that will develop useful new vaccines, new drugs, in a medical sense, is going to be very closely associated with the technology which could put that same knowledge to malign use to producing weapons. And therefore the need to put in place a system of control which will pick up the abuse of this knowledge is absolutely essential.
An organism that could target specific people would be the coming of age of biological weapons. For the first time, there would be no risk of infecting the wrong people, removing the problem of delivery once and for all. More useful than a nuclear bomb, it would leave land, buildings, and your own troops untouched.
Genetic targeting is possible, probably within the next 5 to 10 years. The manufacture of relatively specific biological weapons, which are lethal in small volumes, would be possible within that time period, and that we have therefore a very short opportunity, a timescale, to put in place proper control mechanisms to make sure these weapons are never developed.
Recent events have made governments more aware than ever of the power of biological weapons and of the need to get defences in place. In the immediate future, this means putting more resources into counter-terrorism, into medical and emergency services, but it will also mean preparing for the new bioweapons that technological advances are likely to enable. For there is no way to put the bioweapon genie back in the bottle. No treaty, no international agreement will be able to ensure they will not be developed and used. Nations under threat have only one choice: to find means to defend the population from a terrorist or military attack. Only by such means will it be possible for governments to avoid the type of emergency that has until now seemed unthinkable.